Good evening, and welcome to our Maundy Thursday meditation in place of our face-to-face gathering that we would have had except for the social distancing that we're doing. The picture that you're seeing on your screen right now is a hall in Jerusalem where Jesus and his disciples had their last earthly dinner together. They were in Jerusalem to celebrate the Passover, which faithful Jews did annually. It was a way of remembering what their ancestors had gone through to narrowly escape being held in slavery by the Egyptians. And once a year, this festive, though poignant moment brought that back. Jesus and his 12 closest male followers would have reclined around a table or several tables pulled together to partake of this important meal. There are actually many references to people in this day and time reclining for a meal. And despite the beauty and elegance of Da Vinci's Last Supper, Jesus and his disciples, along with people who were cooking and serving, were in the room, but they were not sitting at a table as they partook of this meal. They were reclining around the table with Jesus at the head of the table and his maybe two closest followers with him. On the menu that night was what's on the menu at most seders that your Jewish friends partake of today when they have their Jewish Seder meals. All of the food symbolic. A lamb shank, which isn't eaten, but it reminds people of the sacrificial system. An egg, which reminds them of the continuance of life, even when there are threats to life. Horseradish, which reminds them of the bitterness of the slavery. A double reminder of the bitterness of slavery with some sort of green bitter herb. Sometimes various kinds of lettuce. There's also yet another green vegetable, something like celery or parsley, which represents hope, and I'll say something more about that in just a moment. And finally, an interesting mixture of apples, dried fruit, nuts, cinnamon, and so forth. Mortar that the slaves would have used day in and day out to do the incessant building projects that they did until they dropped for the Pharaoh, who worked them into utter exhaustion, which was the final straw in helping them know that slavery could not continue. Also on the table would have been a cup of salty water, representing the many, many tears they had shed in their pain and confusion, frustration, hurt. And the celery or the parsley during the meal would normally have been dipped into this salty water before eaten. Then there would have been unleavened bread. That was very important. There were some symbolic things done during the meal that made it important during the serving of the meal, but most importantly, for the Seder and for the Passover celebration was the remembrance that when the Hebrew people left Egypt, it had to be in a hurry There was no time for waiting for bread to rise, the dough to rise before baking it. The bread that they could take with them had to be prepared very quickly, pretty much as they ran out of their doors uh, on cue. There were 4 cups or goblets of wine served on a Passover table, and I think that is still frequently done on most Seder meal tables today. The goblet that you see in the picture is stoneware, presumably set about the time that Jesus would have been under the domination of Rome. But indeed, wine would have been served. It was the typical drink of the day. And as the ancient Hebrews made their escape out of Egypt into the wilderness, of course, they didn't have goblets or wine cups. Their wine was packed into wine skins. And so this was the context of the original Last Supper. Jerusalem, Passover, upper room, Jesus' closest male followers. We don't know where the females were at the moment, maybe on the outskirts of what we see here. Men reclined at the table, and Jesus taking what was already available. They'd already eaten some of this, and turning it into a meal that would be remembered by his followers from there on out. Bread, which his disciples had eaten at every Passover celebration they'd ever been to, and a sip of wine that they had taken at every Passover celebration they'd ever been to, suddenly turned into something else. In a very real sense, what Jesus was talking about at the Last Supper that night was a reality check for him and his disciples. Folks, he said, if the Romans do what I think they're going to do, my body will be broken. But remember it as something broken for you. Toward the end, that God's love be proclaimed even in the face of horrors. And if my blood is shed, and I think it will be, don't remember it as a tragedy alone. Remember it as a sign that sometimes heavy prices have to be paid for good to come about. If you had time to put together a bite of something and something to drink for your Maundy Thursday communion participation tonight, we're going to wait now in a few seconds of silence so that you can eat what you've brought to eat and sip what you've brought to sip. Most of us don't remember when we partake of communion that the night Jesus had the Last Supper with his disciples was also the night that he was arrested and very quickly thereafter rushed to the cross where the Romans executed him. Judas has been portrayed as the great betrayer, the great conniver, who used his connection with Jesus to make a little money. That is a serious misreading of Judas. Judas was one of the most respected among the 12 and one of the closest to Jesus. He believed that Jesus could do a lot more than he was doing to ramp up Jewish opposition to Rome and stop the Roman occupation, the Roman domination, rather, of the Jews. And he thought that by forcing Jesus' hand in this way, by turning Jesus over to the Romans and identifying him with this kiss, that Jesus would come out swinging. But Jesus was committed to nonviolence and the living out of love, regardless of the cost to himself. It's so difficult for many of us to imagine. On the screen right now, you're seeing a clip from Andrew Lloyd Webber's Jesus Christ Superstar, which is supposed to play again on Easter evening. I think this one is worth watching.